The human, who lived alone on a wild and untamed planet, had long accepted the harshness of his world. The air was thick with moisture, the trees were towering, and dangerous beasts roamed the forests. To survive here, one had to be strong, alert, and resourceful. He had grown used to this life, relying on nothing but his instincts and skills to stay alive. Technology and advanced tools were unknown to him. Yet he had survived longer than anyone from his village. One afternoon, while hunting for food, the human heard a loud crash. The sky split open with a fiery trail as something plummeted to the ground not far from him. It wasn't like anything he had ever seen. Cautiously, he made his way toward the crash site, bow in hand, ready to face whatever new threat had come to his world. When he reached the clearing, what he saw left him stunned. There, amid the smoking wreckage, was a large metal object, something beyond his understanding. It was badly damaged, twisted, and broken, but what caught his attention most was the figure lying next to it. It was a woman, but not like any woman he had ever seen. She was tall, with shimmering skin that reflected the light in strange colors. Her clothes were strange, made of materials that seemed far too delicate for a planet like his, and she was clearly injured, struggling to move as she looked around in fear. The human knew the creatures of this forest well, and he could see that the woman would not survive long if she stayed out in the open. The predators here could smell weakness from miles away. Without a second thought, he approached her. She flinched as he neared, her eyes wide with shock and disgust. To her, he looked primitive, barely clothed, with dirt smeared across his skin, and a simple bough slung over his shoulder. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling. It wasn't in his language, but he understood the tone well enough. He raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'll help," he said slowly, though he knew she likely wouldn't understand. Her eyes narrowed, still full of distrust, but as she tried to stand and winced in pain, she had no choice but to let him approach. The human knelt beside her, inspecting her injuries. She had a deep gash on her leg, likely from the crash. He quickly took out some herbs from his pouch, herbs he had used many times before to stop bleeding. The woman watched him with a mix of fear and confusion as he pressed the herbs to her wound. The herbs began to work, and the bleeding slowed. The human gestured toward the trees, indicating they needed to move. He knew it wasn't safe to stay here. The woman hesitated, still unsure of this stranger, but with a deep breath, she nodded. She couldn't afford to be picky. The human helped her to her feet. Her body was weak, and she leaned on him for support. Together, they slowly made their way into the dense forest, moving away from the crash site. Every few minutes, the woman glanced at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. She had never imagined that someone like him, a being from such a primitive world, could be capable of anything useful. As they walked, the human remained silent, focused on keeping them safe. He knew these woods better than anyone, and he knew what dangers lurked within. It wasn't long before the sounds of predators filled the air, creatures drawn to the noise of the crash. The human tightened his grip on his bow. He would need to protect them, and fast. In that moment, the woman began to realize something. This human, though primitive in her eyes, might be her only chance at survival. As they moved deeper into the forest, the human led the alien woman with steady confidence. He stayed silent, always listening for the slightest noise that could signal danger. The woman, still leaning on him for support, couldn't stop her mind from racing. She had been raised in the belief that her people were superior in every way. The human races were seen as primitive and backward, barely able to survive without the help of advanced technology. Yet here she was, relying on this strange, primitive man to keep her alive. They eventually stopped by a small stream. The human helped her sit on a rock and knelt beside her, checking her leg. The herbs he had used earlier had stopped the bleeding, but she was still too weak to walk on her own. "You need rest," he said slowly, using basic words. He didn't know if she understood him, but his calm voice seemed to reassure her. She nodded slightly, though she still watched him with wary eyes. As the human gathered more herbs and plants to prepare food, the woman observed him closely. He moved with purpose, his actions quick and efficient. Despite his rough appearance, There was a quiet intelligence in the way he handled his surroundings. The tools he used were simple, but they were effective. She had to admit that his survival skills were impressive. Once he returned with a handful of edible roots and fruits. He offered her some. She hesitated, but hunger got the better of her. As she ate, she began to feel a little stronger, though the unfamiliar taste of the food made her grimace. The human, noticing her reaction, gave a small, amused smile. It was the first time she had seen any expression on his face other than seriousness. For the first time, she tried to speak to him in his language. Her accent was thick, and she stumbled over the words. "Thank you," she said, her voice shaky. The human raised his eyebrows in surprise but nodded in response. "You're welcome," he replied simply. The brief exchange was enough to ease some of the tension between them, though they still had a long way to go. The forest around them grew darker as night approached. The human, sensing danger, motioned for her to stay close. He moved them to a hidden spot between two large rocks and started a small fire, just enough to keep the wild animals away. As the flames flickered, the woman began to feel a strange sense of safety in this unfamiliar place. Suddenly, a distant growl echoed through the trees. The human's body tensed, and he quickly stood, grabbing his bow. He signaled for the woman to stay low and quiet. Her heart raced as she watched him move with precision, his eyes scanning the forest like a predator himself. Within moments, a massive creature emerged from the shadows. Its eyes gleamed in the firelight, and it sniffed the air, clearly smelling their presence. The woman's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen a beast like this, even with all her advanced knowledge. The creature's size and strength were terrifying. But the human didn't flinch. In one swift motion, he drew his bow and released an arrow. It struck the creature's neck, causing it to roar in pain. Before it could charge, the human had already drawn another arrow, firing it directly into the beast's heart. The creature collapsed, its growl fading into silence. The woman stared in shock. She had seen her people use advanced weapons to defeat enemies, but the human had taken down this giant predator with nothing but a simple bow. It was both impressive and humbling. As the human returned to her side, his face still calm and focused, she realized something she had been too proud to admit earlier. This man, whom she had seen as a primitive, was far more capable than she had imagined. In this harsh world, where survival depended on strength and instincts, he was more than an equal. He was a true ally. For the first time, the woman felt a spark of respect for the human. She wasn't sure how long they would be stuck here, but one thing was clear. She would need him, and perhaps she could learn something from him too. As dawn broke over the dense forest, the human was already awake. He had slept lightly, his ears always tuned to the sounds of the wilderness around them. The alien woman, on the other hand, had barely slept. The events of the previous day, the crash, her injury, the wild predator, played over and over in her mind. She had underestimated this world, and more importantly, the human who had saved her. The human checked her wound again. It was healing, but slowly. She needed proper medical attention, and she needed it soon. He could see the pain in her eyes, even though she tried to hide it. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. The crash site would eventually draw more predators, or worse, other dangers she hadn't spoken of yet. "We need to move," he said firmly, packing up the few supplies he had gathered. He gestured toward the mountains in the distance. "Safety is that way. Higher ground." The woman understood his meaning, even though his words were simple. She nodded, though fear flickered in her eyes. She knew what he didn't. Her people were out there, searching for her. But she didn't know if they would come in time. The longer they stayed on this hostile planet, the more vulnerable she became. She glanced at the small communication device hidden in her pocket. It had been damaged in the crash, but it might still work, if only she could find a signal. The human helped her stand, supporting her as they began their journey through the thick forest. Every step was slow and painful for her, but the human didn't complain or rush her. He moved with patience, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for any threats. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat made the journey even more difficult, and the woman's energy was draining fast. She stumbled several times, her leg giving out beneath her. Each time, the human caught her before she fell, his grip strong and steady. "We're close," he said, his voice calm but urgent. The mountains were looming closer now, their rocky faces promising some form of protection. But he knew they were running out of time. The woman's breathing was labored, and he could see the exhaustion taking its toll. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the forest. The human froze, his instincts flaring. Something was coming, and it wasn't friendly. He tightened his grip on the woman's arm, pulling her close as he scanned the area. Through the trees he saw movement. His heart raced. It wasn't an animal. It was something far worse. Strange, metallic figures moved swiftly toward them, their sleek bodies gleaming in the sunlight. The woman's eyes widened in horror as she recognized them immediately. They were hunter drones sent by her enemies to track her down. "We have to run," she gasped, panic rising in her voice. Her leg throbbed with pain, but adrenaline pushed her forward. The human didn't ask questions. He could see the fear in her eyes and knew they had to move now. He grabbed her hand and sprinted toward the mountains. The forest flew by in a blur, the sound of the drones growing louder behind them. The human's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't let go. He wouldn't let her fall behind. The ground became steeper as they reached the base of the mountains. The human pushed her forward, helping her climb over rocks and through narrow passes. The drones were fast, but they were clumsy in the uneven terrain. This was his advantage. He knew how to navigate the wild, and he would use every bit of that knowledge to survive. But time was running out. The drones were closing in, and the woman's strength was fading. Desperation filled her as she fumbled for the communication device in her pocket. If she could just get a signal, she could call for help. Finally, as they reached a small plateau, the woman raised the device to the sky. A faint signal flickered to life. Her heart leaped with hope. "Please, please work," she whispered, sending out a distress call. The human stood beside her, his bow ready, his eyes fixed on the approaching drones. He didn't understand the device, but he could feel the urgency in the air. This was their last chance. As the first drone came into view, the human pulled back his bowstring, ready to fight. It was now a race against time, between her people finding them and the drones closing in. The human stood on the rocky ledge, his bow aimed at the approaching drones. He could hear the low hum of their engines, growing louder as they closed in. Beside him, the alien woman clutched the small communication device, her fingers trembling as she waited for a response to her distress call. "Come on, please," she whispered under her breath, hoping her people would receive the signal in time. She knew how dangerous these hunter drones were, designed to track and eliminate their targets without mercy. If help didn't come soon, they would both be finished. The human glanced at her, seeing the fear in her eyes. He didn't understand the full situation, but he could tell they were in serious trouble. His grip on the bow tightened as the first drone broke through the trees, hovering just a few feet above the ground. Without hesitation, he let the arrow fly. It struck the drone's metallic body, sending sparks flying, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The machine turned toward them, its red sensors glowing menacingly as it advanced. The human quickly reached for another arrow, but before he could release it, the woman's device crackled to life. A voice, sharp and commanding, came through the static. "Hold your position. We're coming." Her heart leaped with relief. They had heard her. Her people were on their way. "They're coming," she shouted to the human, though he didn't relax. The drones were still closing in, and help wasn't here yet. He fired another arrow, this time hitting the drone's weak spot. The machine sputtered and crashed to the ground with a thud, but more were coming. 3 more drones zipped toward them, their engines whining as they prepared to attack. The human knew they couldn't hold this position for long. They were trapped on the rocky ledge with nowhere to run. The only thing they could do was fight and hope her people arrived in time. The woman's breathing was ragged as she struggled to stay on her feet. Her leg injury was slowing her down, and she could feel herself growing weaker. She glanced at the human, marveling at how calm and focused he remained despite the danger. His primitive weapons might not be enough to stop the drones, but he wasn't giving up. Just as the drones closed in, a loud roar echoed from above. The woman's eyes shot upward, and relief washed over her as she saw a sleek alien ship descending from the sky. It was her people, her rescue team. They had arrived just in time. The human turned his head, noticing the ship as it swooped down, firing bright beams of energy at the remaining drones. One by one, the machines were destroyed in bursts of sparks and smoke. The human lowered his bow, watching in awe as the advanced technology easily dispatched the enemies he had been struggling to fight. The ship hovered above them for a moment before landing on a flat part of the plateau. A ramp extended, and several alien soldiers rushed out, their weapons at the ready. They quickly surrounded the woman and the human, their faces stern and focused. "Queen Lyra, are you injured?" one of the soldiers asked, his eyes scanning her for any signs of harm. "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice was weak. She gestured toward the human beside her. "He saved me. Without him, I wouldn't have survived." The soldiers looked at the human with a mixture of surprise and confusion. A primitive human had saved their queen. It was unheard of. They exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to respond. The human, still standing tall, watched as the soldiers tended to the queen. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he could tell that she was someone important, someone powerful. Yet she had been stranded here, just like him, vulnerable and in need of help. "Thank you," Queen Lyra said, turning to the human with gratitude in her eyes. "You saved my life. I won't forget this." He nodded, not needing many words. The bond between them had been forged in the fire of survival. Despite their differences, they had worked together to survive, and that was something neither of them would forget. As the ship prepared to take off, one of the soldiers turned to the queen. "What about the human? Should we leave him?" Queen Lyra looked at the man who had risked everything to protect her. "No," she said firmly. "He comes with us." The human's eyes widened in surprise as the soldiers motioned for him to board the ship. For the first time, he was leaving the world he knew behind and stepping into a future he never could have imagined. The alien ship soared through the atmosphere, leaving the dangerous planet behind. Inside, the human sat quietly, his eyes scanning the strange surroundings. He had never seen anything like this before: metal walls that hummed with energy, glowing lights that pulsed softly, and the smooth, quiet movement of the ship as it flew through the stars. Everything felt unreal, but the human stayed calm, observing with a quiet curiosity. Queen Lyra sat nearby, her injury now treated by the medics. She still felt weak, but relief washed over her knowing they were finally safe. Yet she couldn't stop thinking about the human beside her. This primitive being, who lived in the wilds of that hostile planet, had saved her life more than once. She glanced at him, wondering what the king would say when they returned. Hours passed, and soon the ship approached a massive space station. The human's eyes widened as he saw it, an enormous structure floating in the darkness of space, far larger than anything he could have imagined. The ship docked smoothly, and the queen stood, motioning for the human to follow. "This is where we part ways," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "But first you must meet someone." The human didn't respond, but he followed her, his expression calm. He didn't know what was coming next, but his instincts told him to stay alert. The queen led him down a series of corridors until they reached a grand room, guarded by heavily armed soldiers. Inside, a tall figure stood waiting. He was regal, dressed in fine robes, with sharp, intense eyes. His presence commanded respect, and the human instantly knew who this was: the king, the alien king. Queen Lyra approached him, bowing slightly. "Father," she said quietly, "I am safe thanks to him." The king's gaze shifted to the human, his expression unreadable. For a long moment he simply stared, his eyes taking in the rough, battle-worn appearance of the man who had saved his daughter. There was silence in the room, heavy and tense. "So," the king finally spoke, his voice deep and powerful, "this human saved you, a primitive being from a forgotten world." Lyra nodded, her voice firm. "Yes, father. Without him, I would not have survived." The king's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the human, studying him. He had heard stories of humans before, wild, dangerous creatures from a distant planet. But he had never imagined one would save his daughter, the queen of his people. It didn't make sense. What drove you to help her? The king asked, his tone almost challenging. You had nothing to gain. The human stood tall, meeting the king's gaze without fear. His answer was simple, spoken in a calm voice. She needed help. The king raised an eyebrow, surprised by the human's bluntness. There was no arrogance or expectation of reward in his words, just a straightforward truth. The human had acted purely out of instinct, out of a sense of duty to help someone in need. For a moment, the king was silent again. Then, a slow smile crept across his face, one of understanding and perhaps even respect. He hadn't expected such bravery and selflessness from a species so often dismissed as primitive and unimportant. You are different from what I expected, the king admitted, his voice softening. Your kind has always been viewed as wild, untamed, but you have proven otherwise. Queen Lyra stepped forward. Father, we cannot forget what he did. He risked his life for me. We owe him. The king looked at his daughter, then back at the human. Yes, he said thoughtfully, we do. He turned to one of his advisors standing nearby. Ensure this man is given all the care he needs. He will not return to his world without our gratitude. The human watched the exchange quietly, still unsure of what to make of it all. He hadn't done any of this for reward, and he certainly hadn't expected to be standing in front of an alien king. But now, it seemed his fate had taken an unexpected turn. The king stepped closer, lowering his voice so only the human could hear. You have done something remarkable today. You saved not just a queen, but the future of an empire, and for that I am in your debt. The human nodded, his expression unreadable, but something in his eyes showed he understood. The bond he had formed with the queen during their fight for survival had now extended to something much larger. He wasn't just a primitive human anymore. He was someone who had earned the respect of an entire alien empire. As the king turned to leave, he paused for a moment, looking over his shoulder. There may come a time when we need your help again, human, and when that time comes, we will find you. With those words, the king left the room, leaving the human standing in the quiet, surrounded by a new world that was now beginning to open up to him.